it's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ian Billick, a scientist and also a leader. And I'm not sure, but a mayor, civic leader. Is that something that we say? I'm Francophone, so please help me with this. Um, and I think the importance why I asked Ian to do this is we can have change. And by implicating ourselves and sharing our experience of science, but also our work experience, we can have a change in our society, in our community. I found that really interesting. Ian earned a BA in math and physics from Trinity University. He completed his PhD at the University of California, San Diego. That's a wonderful place to study. I'm a little jealous. From 2000 to 2025, he served as the executive director of the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory. Wonderful place, right? Um, and I think he led the institution, and we all saw that through major expansion of scientific activities, research infrastructure, and access to field sites, and much more. And I think outreach, and I think so many things that Rumble does so well. Um, he was also the president of the Organization of Biological Field Stations from 2010 to 2012. He chaired the National Science Foundation Biology REU Leadership Council from 2018 to 2023. Um, and I believe now that we need to congratulate him since he received his third mandate from the city of the Crested Butte. That means that he took the time out of his agenda and he had the courage to put his face on a sign and ask people to vote for him. And that takes a lot of courage, and you got success. So congratulations, Ian. And with that, I'd like to welcome Ian for his talk today. Oh, do maybe I'll make you co-host so that you can share your screen if you want to, Ian.
Yeah, that'd be great. And thanks, David, for organizing this. So, and thanks for the wonderful introduction. Um, and I will see, make certain I share the right thing. And can people see my slides?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Um, okay. So I'm going to run through kind of a little bit of my history and the integration between my field station work and sort of my role as an elected official. Feel free to jump in with questions. My current position is mayor. I'm serving my third 3-year term. In the United States, we often talk about weak mayor and strong mayor. And I'm a weak mayor, not necessarily because of who I am as a person, but it's a structural definition, which means that we have a professional town manager that the council hires. And so, like Denver, Mike Johnson is mayor. He works full time. He's got his staff. They answer to him. Whereas Crested Butte, we have a weak mayor system. So I'm one of 7 council members. I run the meetings and sign the papers, and a lot of what I exert is influence. So just for people who are a little less familiar with the American system, and even Americans who may be less familiar with the strong and weak mayor distinction. Um, I started at RMBL in 1988. I'm standing on the left with the blue backpack. I went out there to make that transition from math and physics to biology. I did not get around to taking a biology class to my senior year in college. And as I started thinking about life after graduation, someone gave me wonderful advice, which was think about what you like doing day to day, not like what you want to achieve. And I like science, but I like spending time outside. And Paul Robertson, who was the faculty member down at Trinity University, used to teach the field ecology class out at RMBL. And so he sent me out. And so I came out to Gothic, and Susan Lohr was the director at the time. And when I saw her give her the orientation talk, I thought, oh, wow, she has a really interesting position. And, started thinking about it then. Okay, let's see if I can get my slides to work. Um,
Yes, please. And
Uh,
can you
so
can you try to put it full screen? Is that possible?
can try.
Yeah.
Um,
You can't do worse than me, Ian. So, I've put the bar very low.
um,
I think putting in full screen is something you do individually. Oh, I
how's
see it.
that?
Okay.
Does that
Yeah.
work? It looks to work for me. Is everybody? Yeah? Good.
Yes. Mhm.
Gracias.
Um, So I started at Rumble in 1988 and worked there pretty much off and on continuously ever since. Last summer I think was the first summer that I hadn't. I stepped away last spring, and I think it was the first summer that I hadn't really been tied to Gothic since Ronald Reagan was president, and had not been executive director since Bill Clinton was president. Just to put it in perspective for those of you familiar. So it's 1988 and sort of 2000. Um, but I had a lot of different roles before I became executive director. And for me, it was just a wonderful thing to not have the responsibility. I spent a number of summers where I would go out and volunteer, doing research in the summer, and then make a lot of work, earn a lot of money working on the lab's fence to keep the cows out. So I would work 60, 80 hours a week and then go off and bike tour. So I biked up from Gothic to Yellowstone and then over to the Olympic Peninsula and then down to Tucson. I was winter caretaker. I like to joke I was one of the maybe the only person to ski partway to their PhD defense in San Diego. So I wrote up my thesis and then skied out and then drove the rest of the way to defend. So I had quite a few years where I just sort of enjoyed being at the field station in a lot of different capacities. Jenny, my wife, is shown there in the bottom. We spent a winter caretaking. I learned to sort of ski there in the backcountry and luckily survived. Didn't get caught in any avalanches. One of the things that time period, is really rooted in people and scientists at Rumble that were very focused on policy and environmental policy. So Bob and Scotty Willie are on your top left. Scotty was a scientist that started there in the late 1950s. She was responsible for non-consumptive water rights in the state of Colorado. She was very active in land conservation. She and another scientist would lovingly refer to themselves as the bitch and bastard of Gothic. So they had their own particular approach that some people appreciated and others didn't, but she was very impactful. Paul and Ann Ehrlich, who wrote The Human Population Bomb. John Holdren, bottom left, who is Barack Obama's science advisor, I think the longest serving national science advisor. John Cairns, who taught restoration ecology. I'll say like John Holdren taught a class at Rumble in the early 1990s that I think like 5 or 6 people took, and it was like literally not that long before he went on to be Barack Obama's science advisor. So very small, intimate setting. Gretchen Daly, who's known for her work, National Academy of Sciences on ecosystem services. Theo Colburn, very involved in endocrine disruption, which is now a major area of research. So in the 90s, when it was sort of a formative period for me, surrounded by scientists that were really working at that interface between policy and science. Couple issues I'll just sort of call out because I always find that sort of like the cross connections fascinating. Big issue for our community, the town of Crested Butte, is we have a large molybdenum deposit just west of the town and made national news. The communities sort of fight against it. Michael Soule, who was a faculty member at UC San Diego, and is considered sort of the founder of conservation biology. And that's the first conservation biology book. The last chapter actually talks about Mount Emmons. I think the Soule and Wilcox is maybe 1978, and 78, 79 is when those issues of Mount Emmons were sort of brewing up. So there was sort of this exchange between this place that I was embedded in, but also sort of what's going on in the academic world. Um, Another example, These are multiple articles, hard to read, but multiple articles in the New York Times, all about the scary expansion. So Gothic is, you can sort of see the buildings right there in the bottom left, and that's Snodgrass Mountain. And the ski resort had plans to expand the ski resort onto Snodgrass, just adjacent to the biology laboratory. And Bo Calloway, who owned the ski resort and was driving things forward, had to resign as Gerald Ford's campaign manager in 1976 because of inappropriate influence. There was a Senate investigation. This issue, the scary expansion, is something that persisted through my time as mayor, as was the development of Mount Emmons. And so Rumble and was very much embedded in issues locally with national implications on the policy side as well as the science. I stepped in as executive director in 2001, served in that role for approximately 24 years. This graph is too much to absorb, but I'm an ant biologist, and one of the things that I like is allometry. And the idea is that you can scale life history and physical characteristics with size. And when things scale differently, you create ants that look very different. So if your head size increases super fast as the ant gets larger, your larger ants look very different than your smaller ants. And so one of the things I did was sort of look over 25 years and looked at that scaling and sort of ranked them. And so an institution feels different, and it can be because of the scaling. And so some things grow faster than others. And so it's the relative change of growth that can make an institution feel differently. So in my time, we have seen about 180,000 X increase in internet. Unrestricted donations increased about 42x, all down to scientific publications. There's an economic paradox I sort of forget, but healthcare, one of the challenges is that human productivity doesn't scale the same way as sort of technological advances are. So anyway, it was just sort of a slide I put together to kind of help me understand the changes that I experienced in my 25 years and kind of how it felt differently, just sort of looking at how things scaled. So from scientist station days down at the bottom, technological stuff, physical plant expenses sort of increasing faster. So uh, probably what I would put at the root of change, and Philippe was there for quite a bit of this, was really overhauling the board and governance. Um, RMBL is an NGO, and I think about 25% of field stations are organized as an NGO. And sort of that governance structure, which is very related to the town of Crested Butte, sort of building alignment across diverse stakeholder groups, really figuring out how the Rumble was organized and how it was governed and how decisions were made was at the root of what drove a lot of our success and really the root of the experiences that I gained to help me step into the mayor's role. Part of that change in governance was how we managed research. Rumble was a place in the if you look at our age structure in scientists, there was very little recruitment of scientists into Rumble in the 1990s. So we have scientists that started in the 1980s, a lot of scientists that started in the 2000s, not a lot of scientists that started in the 1990s. And that was because of territoriality and people being chased out. So there were some important things related to governance. So it wasn't just the board of trustees, but also how we managed research. Um, Financially, so governance is probably the core thing, but then you have to translate that into finances. We changed how we managed our indirect in 2003. We overhauled our financial systems in 2008, set up a development office in 2009. Through my later years, we really were able to take our land base, and Hillary has done similar things down at Archbold, but use our land base and monetize that. So monetize it without selling, so a way that supports the mission of the organization, but created some significant financial resources. So a bunch of different financial moves that gave us capacity. Um, Led to a significant increase in the quality of the buildings, the residential improvements. For those of you who've been at OBFS meetings and probably appreciated some of those improvements. Um, our operational buildings. So we had the research center, which was stimulus money from 2009. Private philanthropy, the dining hall community center where the OBFS meetings were supported. And I'm showing photographs. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that we are embedded, even when you're a leader in an organization, we're embedded in a larger network. And all you're doing is supporting that network and sort of releasing the capacity of that larger group. And so, really trying to show some of the faces and individuals that were involved in these, because none of these, even though I might have been the executive director, it was very much sort of a team effort that made all of these things happen. Um, we have a lot of historic buildings. I think a very important part of what we did was not just build new buildings. It's much cheaper, at least until a couple years ago, until COVID, it was much cheaper to build new buildings than renovate historic buildings. But I think the history and the culture, the sense of coming into a new place and discovery is very important to the educational experience and the students' willingness to become new people. Um, our infrastructure, it's like a mini town. When I stepped into the town, like it was essentially the same issues. So dealing with wastewater, water augmentation, do we have rights to the water, our water system, our internet? We really overhauled a lot of that. Um, a big part of what we did was we expanded the nature of the science that was done. Brumble historically is very strong in terms of biology, long-term research, but we added hydrology in 2014, big atmospherics presence in 2020. A lot of cultural changes associated with that. These disciplines think in very different ways. They think about research in different ways, different cultural approaches. There's a lot of crosstalk that was needed to really open it up. I want to say, we research committee is like, there's no more room for stream research. Like everything that's being done, is being done. And then within a couple years, we probably saw that increase 20-fold simply because we brought in disciplinary diversity. Because hydrologists, they use sensors and they approach things in very different ways. You can see that reflected. So I'm showing here three graphs. The long tail on the left is the number of research days, which is just how many we track the intensity of use. The middle graph, or the sort of orange or yellow, if you're not too colorblind, shows the number of scientists. And then the bottom graph is the number of projects. You can see the dip there during COVID. We were actually able to stay open in COVID, which was a minor miracle. We were starting to see a little bit of a tail off as some of these larger atmospheric and hydrology projects moved through. But a very long period of stasis translated after about 10 to 15 years into a significant increase. And it's actually working on this today, this morning, understanding the relationship between longevity of leadership and the impact on an organization. Actually had a major donor, David Weekly, who came to me in about 2010, is like, the research says that nonprofits don't really blossom until they've been in the position for about 10 years. And so his philanthropic reach is very international, though he's rooted here in the community. But he was very focused on that 10-year sort of time period. And you can kind of see it reflected at least for superficial reasons, in terms of the number of scientists, number of projects, and all that. Undergraduate research, kudos to my wife, Jenny, on your left, Christina Jones, who is a Rumble board member, former undergraduate from Stanford University. We completely overhauled that program, really opened that up, made it strong financially. Great collaborations with LA community colleges. So it's a little counterintuitive, but we really increased the cost of the program increased the number of fellowships we offered and saw dramatic improvements in the diversity, economic as well as ethnic diversity and participation in the program. But it required building very intentional relationships with Hispanic serving institutions. And we really focused on relationships rather than transactions. That's been sort of something I've long emphasized is we need to invest in relationships, and often we approach things transactionally. Um, Sort of coming to the end of my time at Rumble, that is very involved in land conservation. So Rumble is embedded in a public lands and private property matrix. And so we were able to do a number of transactions related to the Gothic town site. So we bought in holdings within the field station, which is an old mining town that had been abandoned. We had to replat that. There were sort of some legal issues that had never been resolved, clean that up. That conservation easement of the Gothic town site, that town site is now dedicated legally in perpetuity for research and education, could never be sold or used for other purposes. The Trampy project is significant at the state and probably national level. So it was about an 8,000 acre, eight figure in terms of finances, conserve that landscape, build Trampy. That ranch is the second largest private property owning in Gunnison County. The Ute Mountain Utes have the largest land holding, and Gunnison County is larger than two states. I think Delaware and Rhode Island, just to give you a sense of the context and perspective. But we were able, Susan Lohr, Rumble's former director, really sort of ran herd and helped to make that happen. So huge kudos to her, Justin Spring and Bill Trampy, who's shown there. We had three other projects, Maxfield Meadow, properties that were adjacent to Rumble or distant from Rumble on the order of like 40 to 160 acres. A bunch of smaller transactions, really rationalizing that landscape. Um, it wasn't just land conservation, but also land management. So David and Bonnie Weekly, we put together a visitor center. That visitor center, I think when I started, we grossed about $10,000 a year, and now it grosses about 300,000 a year, and we manage about 30,000 visitors. We intercept more visitors in that visitor center than the Mount Crested Butte and Gunnison Chamber of Commerce's combined. We reduced private development on the lab's border by 80%, which would have had huge impacts. The ski area was finally removed from the ski area permit. Vail no longer has access or rights to that. We created a research and education special area around Gothic, and we have national legislation pending that would designate the area, public lands around Gothic, congressionally for research and education. So it wasn't just conservation in terms of land acquisition, but it was also management. Really, that interest in land management led me to get involved locally. And the four main entities that I've been involved with in my career are the school. I'm not going to talk about that so much. My wife was actually sworn in as a school board member last night. A special district, the Metropolitan Recreation District, that is property tax. Gunnison County, I chair the county's planning commission, and then the town of Crested Butte. The Planning Commission, I'm showing Gunnison County there in red. That gives you a sense of scale and location. But I served as chair of that. I think it was in 2004. We had Democrats sort of sweep in and take control of the county, sort of moving it from moderate ranching Republicans to more sort of progressive Democrats. And the chair of the county commissioners at the time asked me to step into the planning commission, and I did. And I ended up chairing that for almost 4 years. We overhauled the process by which it worked. First time a project been denied. The Bull Mountain natural gas line was sort of significant at the state level in terms of governor politics and elections. We started affordable housing and community housing, didn't make a lot of progress. Um, I was involved with accountability and property tax. So I helped lead an effort that increased the budget for the school district about 15%. That was very significant. Helped us maintain class sizes. We added full day kindergarten, added counselors. back in 2014. So it was important for our ability to retain staff at Rumble. The Metropolitan Recreation District, crazy stuff. I told you everything that happened, like you would not believe me. I'll give you like one example. Just after it was a hostile takeover, 5 positions, and we had 3 that ran a competitive election. Right after I was elected, the first issue we were dealing with was Russia Today stopped working, and I went to the district manager and say, why is it that in rural Colorado, the first issue that I'm dealing with is like Russia Today is not getting transmitted? And they said, well, you do know the guy you beat in the election has a mail order Russian bride. And I was like, I did not know that. So anyway, sort of the stories and the issues that we sort of dealt with, sort of mind-boggling. Probably a whole series of books or a television series that people would not believe. But we did something I think that's very special, which is it was really designed to serve over-the-air television, like a technology from the mid 70s that doesn't make sense anymore, but it's still kind of what the district's there. But in the late 90s, they got the Colorado Attorney General to rule that television was recreation. I think your brain like is less active watching television than it is like sleeping, but it allowed them to grab money. So we essentially grabbed that district and redirected it away from over-the-air television. And it's very much in my mind related to conservation, which is by providing inputs into recreation, you have control over recreation. So by being able to fund trails, you can control where those trails are. And so, it funds nonprofits, Rumble's education program. Peter Raven, ask him what was it about the sort of Missouri Botanic Gardens, and they talk about sort of creating tax districts. Denver does this too. That was really important to some of those nonprofits. So it's interesting combination of like supporting nonprofits that are aligned with the interest of the community around recreation, and then using those inputs to kind of harness recreation in the service of conservation. And it's something that's now getting implemented sort of at the state level. Okay, Crested Butte, Mayor. I was appointed to the council on September 21 to an open position. I was simultaneously running a campaign and was elected mayor in November of 21. They're 2-year terms. Crested Butte likes to keep their mayors on a very short leash. It was a race against someone who's probably more conservative. More recently, I ran uncontested in 23, and then there was, a race that we finished up about 2 weeks ago. This challenge was more from the left, and the results were largely the same. I think I'm the first person to serve in 3 consecutive terms since the late 60s, so it's a little unusual for the town. Just a few highlights. Mount Emmons, Red Lady, right? Started this 77, 78, sort of showed you that. We largely finished that off. So Michael Bennett down in your bottom left, that's one of our U.S. senators, and Deb Haaland, who things have changed a lot in the last couple of years. So she's a Pueblo Native American and was Secretary of Interior. And Bennett was as senator was running a reelection campaign, and in what at the time was considered a purple state. So he had the opportunity to ask our president at the time. I almost got shot when I pulled my cell phone out to take this photograph. There were snipers up in the cliffs above, but he had the ability to ask for 2 or 3 things, and one of the things that he asked for included some steps on a mineral withdrawal and permanent protections for Red Lady. So and that photo of Jenny and I down in the bottom middle was a photo that ran in the Colorado Public Radio, and a piece that was carried by NPR. So we have celebrated the permanent protections of Mount Emmons. Project 2025. I think this is actually listed as one of the rollbacks. But so far, I don't think that is going to happen. Affordable housing. We live in a resort community. super fortunate. I'm so lucky in so many different ways. Bought a house. Jenny and I bought a house in 2018 that appreciated, I think, over $1 million within the 12 months after we owned it. And so, it works for us, but it doesn't really work for anybody else who's in the workforce. And so, one of the big campaign issues in 2021 was, can community members continue to afford and live here? And there's a lot of stuff. I don't know if you people follow Ezra Klein. He's written a book, Abundance with Affordable Housing, and it affected sort of the presidential. Trump and Biden were sort of arguing about this, but there's a lot of policy stuff on affordable housing. And since I've been mayor, collaborating with the county of Gunnison as well as the town of Mount Crested Butte, we have 325 housing units that have been built or are in the process of being built. And to put that into context, and these are all deed restricted that are targeted for the local community. To put that in perspective, Crested Butte has about 1,200. So the North Valley is adding about 25% of Crested Butte's housing stock just for the community. The metric that I track is how many housing units are lived in the town of Crested Butte, are lived in year round. If you go to a place like Steamboat or some of the other ski resorts, those numbers will be about 15%. So that means 85% of those housing units are dark, are they being used for short-term rentals. Town of Crested Butte, we're around 66%. That's likely to bump up into the low 70%. And so it's essentially the hollowing out of the community. Workers don't have a place to stay. You don't have a real community because most of your homes are sitting empty. One of the other big issues, town of Crested Butte, we require electrification for new builds. So if you look at the international strategy for how we're going to address climate change, it's really electrifying, getting that grid so that it's green and renewables. State of Colorado, our particular energy sources. There's some stuff going on, between the state and the feds on drill baby drill and coal. But by 2030, and it's regulated by the Public Utility Commission, which is state level, about 70% of our energy mix should be solar and renewables. And the town of Crested Butte, it's one of a handful of communities in the country, including Berkeley and some communities back east. I think we're still the only town in Colorado that requires new builds to be fully electrified. And the natural gas really came after us. And part of it is because if you can do it in Crested Butte where temperatures drop 40 below, air, air source heat pumps or some of the new technology doesn't work well in very cold temperatures. But if you can do it here, you can do it everywhere. So that was one of the major moves. And I've, given this talk to other municipalities because people are concerned, like, how do you do this politically? And I point out, like, we passed this and we had uncontested elections at the next round. So, climate change is a winning issue, not a losing issue. And then the Gunnison Outdoor Resource Protection Act, and that's Jeff Hurd, our Republican. So he replaced Lauren Boebert. For those of you who follow U.S. politics, Lauren Boebert is among the growing, increasingly larger small group of crazy people, but she represented us. And Jeff is a moderate Republican that got into the race and pushed her out. And so I think I was like one of the first people to actually endorse Jeff. Senator Bennett, in particular, had been working on the Gunnison Outdoor Resource Protection Act for like 10 years. And we finally got it introduced, and then Jeff signed on, and it's got wilderness in it, right? And so we got a bipartisan wilderness bill that has been labeled one of the most ambitious public lands bills in decades. And I've taken no shortage of grief, which I'm happy to take, for supporting a moderate Republican. If that position were to determine whether the Democrats or Republicans controlled the House, I might change on that. I am an independent, so I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. But we've made some interesting progress. He was the only Republican to vote against the public land sale in the committee. He's on the Natural Resources Committee, and I raised that issue with him well before it hit there. I also raised the extension of premium healthcare tax credits, and he was one of 3 or 4 that was out last week that sort of pushing in the House to get that extended. So just some final thoughts because I wanted to leave some time for questions. A lot of politics is showing up. I really emphasize influence and not power. Everybody thinks it's about power. The reality is most of all the good things in life happen through networks, and it's influence that matters. It's not really the power, at least the level I work at. Curiosity, engagement, just always asking questions, learning about others. We had an open position, and so a lot of people were talking about applying for the town council. And the advice I give is it's got to work for you personally. You can't start with the impact. You've got to start with where you find joy and nourishment, and get that balance. And then, you've got to stay focused on outcomes. So if you're going to take one of these spots and you're going to push someone out from doing it, so I ran a competitive election, you really got to hold yourself accountable, even if the voters don't hold yourself accountable. So anyway, I'll stop there and see if people have questions. Thanks for taking the time. It's been kind of a fascinating and fun journey, and I'm very fortunate to have been, had a little bit of a seat, maybe in the nosebleed section more than the ringside, and some really cool stuff.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ian. There was a few things especially the climate change is a winning. I really like that. That's a great quote. So we're here to ask questions, and so please raise your hand, and I'll maybe easier since it's a great turnout. 19 people, 17, 18. That's fantastic. Just raise your hand so that I can monitor and assign you. I think I see Philippe.
You do.
There you go.
Ian, I'm curious to hear from you how your experience trying to influence scientists at RMBL over issues translated over into the political arena, or how or if it did translate over there.
Yeah, so I tell people being mayor is way easier than running a field station. Running a field station, you have to probably keep somewhere in the order of 80 to 95% of the scientists and critical stakeholders happy, right? Like if you start losing more than 5 or 10%, like the world starts falling apart. And in politics, if I get 55 to 60% of the vote, I am like a political genius. So I have like 20 to 30 extra percentage points. And so, and also, even though I was director, the reality is that my impact was very much I had to be influenced. It wasn't the decisions that I made, but the ability to navigate those networks and deal with complex stakeholder groups. And so the lessons I learned as a field station director, I feel like really set me up well to be effective as mayor because I had a lot of helpful experience on how to make things happen. And there was no illusion it was going to be because I just all of a sudden like could start making decisions. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think I tell my kids, like, think a lot about influence and be very careful around power because power is not always out. Even when you start accumulating, it's not usually a helpful thing. So anyway, those are a few things about like what I learned as a field and then infrastructure capital replacement plans. Town of Crested Butte, we just finally got our first full capital replacement plan, which anybody who's had to deal with failing infrastructure at field stations could appreciate like why that would be my personal one of my wonderful things to see happen with the town. And they actually have property tax. So at Rumble, I had to figure out how to go out and squeeze money out of philanthropy because I certainly wasn't going to squeeze it out of scientists. With the town of Crested Butte, like we have this wonderful thing called mill assessments, and so property taxes, we have to get voter approval for increases, but it's much easier to have a tax than it is to like. Anyway, I'll stop there.
I think it's the first time I hear somebody praise taxes, but that was a joke. So Jen, please.
Hey, thanks. Hey, Ian, it's good to see you. It's interesting because I spent the last couple of years doing community development work in Maine, so I have a lot of similar experiences that what you're talking about. And I actually just gave a talk this week about how all that I thought about running a field station, what I thought was going to serve me going into communities and helping them with affordable housing and working waterfront shoreline protection stuff like was great, but not what was really needed. And like you're saying, influence and relationships are everything, and trust, because you got to build trust. But anyway, so I have a very detailed, specific question, which is the electrification requirement, which I love the idea of. And there's been a big push in Maine for that. But it's tricky, and you have the same tricky problem about heating. And like the heat pumps aren't necessarily, you usually need some kind of backup and something else when it gets really cold. Tell me about how.
I don't think that's necessarily true. We're still learning, and I think there's a real cost to being on the forefront of a learning curve, because, probably our biggest challenge is workforce. I think the IRA, the Infrastructure Reduction Act, or whatever it was, that Biden passed, workforce has been a big issue. So getting so not just like if you can do it technically, having the workforce that's capable of implementing on a cost-effective basis, because if you move too fast on that, you engender a backlash. I would say we have, yeah, I guess I should be careful in names since it's recorded and out there, but I'll say we had an individual in the community who is actually an elected official down in Texas who has a very different take on electrification and climate change. And I pointed out that his large-scale development, he was upset, because of the electrification and how it created problems. And I pointed out that his project was fully electrified, which he didn't know, but he had done it because he owns the property and is renting them out, and it made a lot of sense financially for him to do that. And so there's this perspective that we're doing this as a top down, and there's a premium or cost to this. I think Bill McKibbins is really out there, and his book, Here Comes the Sun, lays this out fairly well. It's the right financial decision and economic decision. I think the technology is largely there. One of the things we got is, oh, you have to have natural gas because when the electricity goes out, well, the reality is with modern building code, your natural gas heating doesn't work when the electricity is out. So it doesn't actually, there are a lot of myths out there about the technology that are perpetuated by the industries.
Well, just to also add to that, I just put in the comments, I'm also thinking in Maine, it's an old housing market that wants to be maintained, and the old houses and heat pumps are a more challenging situation than new builds and heat pumps, which are easier to build for, right? So,
New construction is way easier
yeah.
than renovating, and new technology is way better than old. And the next frontier for the town of Crested Butte, and no one has figured it out yet, we're still thinking about this, is how so part of the larger national strategy is to reduce energy consumption in the first place. So I left that out. Electrify, and then green your energy grid. And how we deal with existing building stock is a political as well as technical challenge that I haven't found anybody, any community that's really figured that out. But that's sort of the next frontier for the town of Crested Butte and what everybody's sort of watching.
Mr. Barnes,
Brian?
Brian, yep.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Great talk and congratulations to all your successes. I want to take you back, though, to the beginning of being a station manager. And I recall you saying that a transformative change was with your board of trustees, or maybe it was the steering committee back then, from being composed of scientists there that are going to argue about, who's going to change the toilet paper in the outhouses, to really broadening out to people who have a larger perspective and land trust and influential people. And I'm just curious how that went. And then of your current Board of Trustees, just what authority do they have over running the station?
Yeah, so we're set up as an NGO and they have all the authority. So
Okay.
they can make whatever decision they want. So it doesn't mean they're making the right decisions, but they have that authority. They hire and fire and evaluate the executive director. They approve the budget. We have a tax filing, and so we actually have to certify, what policies are in place. So as an NGO, they have all of the authorities, and it's really up to them how they decide to exercise that. And when I did come in, and I had been a graduate appointee, or I think it was elected to the board of trustees, so I had experience with the board in the 90s, and so I had a bunch of conditions really around governance. So it wasn't about how much I earned, but it was how it was going to be run. And they agreed as a condition of me taking the job that we would move towards an expertise board. So not just the scientists that were very focused. And I'd have to go back to the minutes, but there probably is a meeting where we talked about how many rolls of toilet paper it was appropriate to stock in the outhouse, because you're going to waste if you put too much out there at the end of the year. Anyway, so there was sort of an agreement to go to it. Philippe has probably sat through some of those conversations at the tail end of them, but sort of really getting to an expertise model where the scientists are a critical part. Someone who is involved in the board that Philippe overlapped with, I think, was Gary Weed, who was a frustrated field biologist, dropped out of his PhD program because he had sort of a challenging PhD advisor and ended up in finance with Exxon. He's like, Exxon has done really well because they wedded geology with the finance. And if the geologist ran things, it was a disaster. And if the finance people ran things, it was a disaster. And you had to create an environment that created a wonderful mix of those perspectives and put them in constructive tension. And so I think Rumble, in my opinion, a lot of the success was bringing in people with legal expertise, with land conservation expertise, with financial strategic planning, having a meaningful scientific group also involved in governance, but creating a dynamic tension among those groups.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful.
And Philippe, do you want to offer any observations from your time?
Yeah, you raise a lot of memories. So, I mean, one of the things I will say that I was on the board for 8 years, and when I left the board because I felt like it had gone far enough in a transition that I was occupying a space that could be occupied by somebody with more resources, and that's one of the things that RMBL really needed. But during the time I was there, I got to see this board change from what was mostly scientists to people with different kinds of expertise. And that really changed the dynamic a lot. And I think one of the most important dynamics, and Ian, you can disagree with this or not, but when the board was completely composed of scientists and they were all in the weeds, what that does is it creates a dynamic of distrust between the board and the executive director because the board is engaged in things that the ED should be managing all the time. And as that board started to change and they started looking at things from a higher elevation, a lot of trust I think was able to grow between the ED and the board that otherwise would have had a hard time developing. And it was one of the things I really got to see, and I was really pleased to see the change because I was definitely an outsider when I came onto the board, and by the time I left, it didn't feel like the same dynamic anymore.
And I'll say I'm a big fan of levels of organization. So I worked on ant colonies, and human cities are just an inferior version of what the ants have figured out, right? Like they got to agriculture
I
well
was
before
just an
us.
ant to you, huh?
And I think this idea of a field station having an identity beyond and separate from individual scientists is a really important one and often underappreciated. Aaron Robinson had a really nice thesis defense earlier this week. She'd done some nice work on field stations and sociology and data management. And she made this point, which is like, how do these institutions have an identity? And it's got to be a collaborative relationship and it's got to be mutually supportive, but they are separate roles and separate things. And if you don't understand that, you're never going to figure out how to create that relationship between scientists and the institution that really moves things forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there was also a generational change on that board too, while I was there, and that was really important as well. That it was really important for there to be younger people, and that doesn't mean young, but it means people that didn't come all from a much older generation.
Yeah. I have a question, Ian, if that's okay, and really, what would be your advice, being a mayor now, to a manager or a director of a field station? What would you tell him or tell yourself when you were starting out? Would you say, implicate them more or not? Or what would you advise?
Yeah, probably what I would tell her would be
Yeah, by
to
anybody of
yeah,
us, or
yeah.
not
Um,
Rumble, but anybody in general.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting because I say I joke, but I think it's true that if I've been qualified to be executive director, Rumble would not have hired me, right? And so, if I'd had an MBA, I would have been qualified, but I would have been dismissed out of hand, PhD and studying ants. There's nothing inherently about that training that gave me that position other than no one else was crazy enough to sort of do the job. So I think I got it simply by default, largely by default. Actually know that to be true. But I think what allowed me to grow through the position was to really be self-critical around outcomes. And so I cared enough because I was there, met my wife there, my kids were born there. It's really defined me professionally as well as personally that I really wanted the institution to thrive. And so the standard that I always had to hold myself to is like, did we actually make Rumble a better institution and what does it take? And so I think a lot of people get lost in process and the trappings of a position. But if you hold yourself to outcome and you really push yourself to understand why you're not getting there, then you develop that intentionality of process and you force yourself to get on a learning curve. So to me, I think probably I had the good fortune to really hold myself and have people that held me as well, a board that held me to outcomes. So be intentional about your outcomes. Be honest with why you're not getting there. Don't externalize those. Most people say, oh, like if Trump wasn't elected, if COVID didn't come in. I mean,
Mm,
there is like an infinite number of reasons about the external world for why you're not driving the outcome you want, but they don't matter. What matters is what your leverage points are and your ability to implement them because the world has not changed by people telling you you can't do things. The world's changed when you actually take ownership of what you're capable of influencing. So there's an honesty and a reality there that I think is critical.
yeah, yeah. And do you think it's important for a city to be in link with its field station? Because I don't know if my question is clear.
It's a wonderful opportunity, right,
Yeah.
for a municipality to have a field station.
Mm-hmm.
It diversifies the local economy. Crested Butte is known for our wildflowers, and Rumble was a big part of that, sort of that transition to outdoor recreation. It's something that's talked about, and I think Rumble has been critical to that. So, I think for institutional growth, I'm a big fan of doing like a positional analysis. Like, what is it that you are uniquely positioned as a field station or a municipality to offer? And
Mm-hmm.
a field station like Aspen does not have RMBL. So
No.
Aspen has a lot of things that Crested Butte will never have, but they will never have an RMBL. And so there are things that Crested Butte can do because of Rumble's presence that an Aspen or Vale or Breckenridge will never have that opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that concludes our so let's thank Ian and congratulate him for his reelection. And stay tuned for the next virtual cafe in January, I believe.
Please run for higher office.
I don't have it in me.
Yeah, no, that I understand. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.